Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about something I'm seeing a lot more of, and something I didn't quite understand, which is the black activist claim, the CRT goons and that sort of stuff. The black activist claim, or the American, African-American activist claim that blacks have been uniquely disenfranchised out of really a civic and social participation, and also out of the opportunity to share evenly or equally in the post-World War II boom, which saw the rise of what today we understand as suburbia and the suburban sort of existence and lifestyle. Now, I happen to live in an adult suburban area that's sort of 98, 99% white. And now if, I was in the grocery store a few days ago, and a black African, not African-American, but a black African guy was in there. And it's so rare in this area that it turned heads. So anyway, the argument goes like this, and I didn't understand this. I sort of heard it before, and I thought, what are they talking about? It seemed a bit silly to me on the surface, but so I delved into it a little bit, and so I'll kind of share this with you now. The argument is, in post-World War II, most people lived in cities or near to cities. Until the end of World War II, then with the GIs, the soldiers coming back, not simply in the United States, but in other countries, like Australia and so on, that the government was doing various things like offering, good, the GI Bill, I think it was called in the United States, access to college and that for returning GIs, on the basis that they'd missed out on their education, or their education had been stunted by having to serve in the military during the war. But also they were giving various loans, and government underwritten loans or partially underwritten by governments, federal and state, to create these suburban sort of housing estates. Now, what it meant was that people were moving, who could get these loans, were moving from the city to these new suburbs, which would have been really middle distance in today's parlance. Now, at the same time, in the United States, there was a huge network of freeways and motorways being built that was linking suburbs and areas of the city, and also linking cities and towns and so on. It was a very considerable undertaking, and one that you can only look on in awe today with just the sheer scale of it. Now, the claim from the black activists and people like the current Transportation Secretary in the United States, Pete Buttigieg, who does nothing but talk about there's too many evil white people everywhere, and roads are racist and all that sort of stuff, which is really him echoing and parroting the more extreme end of the African-American activist type story and narrative that they push. So the argument goes like this: that the loans were given to white people. This is returning white servicemen, given to white people, but not to the black diaspora, and that these loans were dished out, or the education opportunities for education and loans were dished out I think there's a claim that something like 8% or 7% of the people serving in World War II were black, and therefore 7% of the loans, for example, should have been to black people, but only 3% of the loans were. So there's an argument that not as many blacks were getting the loans as white people, and also that the people giving or the folks that were able to access a college education were, I think they're claiming 98% white, 92% black. So this is again held up as the outcomes were different, therefore the only explanation was racism. So they go into a number of subsets of this. So when these loans were put on offer, there was a lot of people that were renting or had, you know, quite small inner city apartments, and given the GIs coming back, there was, you know, there was the huge baby boom. There was a certainly vigorous 10 years of procreation there, and people were saying, well, hey, we've got this sort of 2-room, 3-room apartment or something in the inner city, which was already, you know, pretty crowded. So, and given the amount of factories and jobs that were moving to the suburbs, then it made sense if there was an opportunity to move to the suburbs. And there was a you know, a lot of property developers, you know, the Jewish property developer Levitt, in, I think it was New Jersey or around there, I think also maybe in Pennsylvania too, was putting together these you know, very planned and quite manicured estates where the houses were very similar, and so say 2-story, 3 or 4 bedroom house on a 800, you know, square yards or 1,000 square yards of land, and there'd be roads and parks and, you know, it was a nice, clean looking, neat, manicured sort of place, and a lot of people like that sort of thing. It's better than living in the city there. You know, you've got some space and even some lawn outside your front door. So a lot of the GIs took the loans and bought these houses. And if you look at the price of the houses, then compared to, say, the average wage, then these houses, and then you add the loan in, the fairly generous sort of loan conditions, then it was easy to see why it was attractive to people. So the people who could access the loans, you know, had the jobs, had the money, had the income, and were procreating, could go to these packaged towns, if you will, or estates. And this is what the suburbs was. Now, this was primarily white people that were moving. Now, the black activist argument is, well, the white people were moving, and they were taking their better jobs, their better salaries, the taxes they were paying. They were taking all that and moving out of the city, which then turned the city into a ghetto, where there were less taxes, and the local, you know, city council had less money to spend on improvements and, you know, repairing roads and things like that. So they're saying this is white flight, and the white flight caused the poverty of the black people. Now that's a bit of a stretch, if you don't mind, but that's the rationale that or part of the rationale at least, that they're applying. Now there's some more subsets here. It's more nuanced than just straight yes or no on this one. But the other argument was that, or another argument they put forward, is that black people wanting to buy property in black neighbourhoods, they had a harder time accessing the government approved loans and subsidised subsidies for buying housing, because they would want to live among other black people in a black area, and the property values were less and the risks were higher. You know, it's a high crime neighbourhood. There's a lot of you know, arson and all sorts of things there. Unemployment is regular. People can't afford to pay their loans and these sorts of things. So it was much harder for the black people to get loans because of the more impoverished areas and, say, the irregular employment. So and the lower incomes and that sort of stuff. So the black activists say, well, because they had lower incomes, racism, harder to get a loan because the area was a poor, deprived area. More racism. The fact the area was deprived is because the white people moved out. White flight, yet more racism. So they're arguing the whole thing is like a massive you know, intergalactic racial plot against black people, when clearly that's utter nonsense. But nonetheless, let's follow the thread through, because there are other aspects to this. Now, if a black guy, let's say a GI, an African American, wanted to buy a property in an all-white neighbourhood, it was difficult for him to do that because the argument was if you move into the neighbourhood, you'll lower the value for the white property values for the white people. Now that just in isolation wasn't really true. So this idea that and this includes Jewish property developers as well, they would have sort of white-only covenants on certain neighbourhoods. Now, in other neighbourhoods where there was no white-only covenant, there's another racist argument comes in here that white people would not want to buy in an area that did not have an all-white covenant attached to it. So if black people were able or were allowed or able or could afford or whatever the reason were able to get property in an area, then white people wouldn't buy it and wouldn't buy property in that area. Therefore, it became a black-only area, and therefore it turned into a ghetto. Again, that's not the fault of the white people. So to argue that's racist is, again, really a stretch. So looking sort of overall at the various arguments about racism and so on are tenuous, and again relying heavily on the different outcomes. Now, the areas where black people were allowed to build or were allowed to buy, rather, these packaged up towns that were popular after World War II, tended to be smaller houses. They were wood, not brick, and they were less featured. They didn't have the same amount of recreational areas, things like that. But I've driven through one of these towns that was built in Pennsylvania after the war, and it's an absolute ghetto. It's not a place where you want to stop. Even stopping at traffic lights is like, ooh, do I want to do this? So it looks like a rough, unkempt area. People's front yards are jungles. There's derelict cars in front yards that are rusted out hulks and so on. It looks like a very unpleasant area, and there's only appears to be, from certainly what I could see, only appears to be African Americans living there. So when the banks or the loaning institutions and other sort of local government people were involved, they would say, well, why do the areas that the African Americans live in, why are they so terrible by comparison? Where are the neat manicured lawns and the white painted fences? Where are the nice, clean, tidy parks where there are no goons or heavies or drug dealers? Why is one area so clean and tidy with low crime? Why is social trust so high in that? And then you go to this area that may only be 10 miles away or something, but the place looks like a shit heap, a shithole, and there are criminals running around everywhere, and there are dead bodies being found on the street, and there's an endless wail of ambulances and police sirens and so on. So why is it in this area, not that area? So this idea that the area is the blacks moving into an area was something due to simply racism, again, is absurd. It was due to behavioural differences. Now, I want to add another couple of things. During the war, people were, soldiers were fighting cheek to jowl, shoulder to shoulder. Now, there's a lot of folks running around trying to kill you. You have to rely on the people around you to pull their weight, and hopefully you'll survive the conflict and not get shot. But even in spite of that, and again, there was less than 1 in 10 of the soldiers were black, and a lot of the black conscripts were doing things like digging the trenches and in the supply department, or doing the cooking and the chefing and that sort of stuff. So the ratio of frontline soldiers was different. So these white soldiers and black soldiers having to fight together. And again, if there's people trying to kill you and there are bombs dropping everywhere, you've got to rely on the people around you. And there's nothing, certainly by my experience, there's nothing that creates a sense of intense camaraderie more than people together who faced imminent death but survived and had to rely on each other to survive. That creates a sense of camaraderie there. And yet these white soldiers coming back from the war nearly all the black people didn't want to go into the white neighborhoods, and pretty much all of the white soldiers did not want to go into the black neighborhoods, and didn't want to live in an area where black people would be. So there was the behavioral differences between the two was such that they really didn't want to mix, and didn't want to intermingle at all. So to claim that that's white racism is a stretch. Now, another claim is that these roads, the highways and all that sort of thing, were more designed to connect white towns and neighborhoods and suburbs than they were others. I mean, you could debate that to a large extent, but given the biggest concentration of people that needed mobility to get to work and so on was in those white satellite suburbs, then of course that's where you'd build your roads, and there'd be coordination between where these estates being built and the road network, and that's understandable. So the argument that it was therefore racist because the roads didn't go to where the black neighborhood is going to be, or that they went there but not the same quality of road, that was in itself racist. Again, it's an equal outcome thing. Well, you got this road, how come we didn't get that road? Therefore racism. And I'd reject that. So there's a lot of claims about that this is a representation of systemic racism and so on. It comes very much back to this critical race theory type analysis of what went on in the past. So we'll now look at the past through a different set of eyes, and we'll just say that everything that happened was racist and was all bad, evil white people. Now, properties in black neighborhoods would frequently go, this is where nearly all blacks would move in, or all blacks would move into a neighborhood, the property values would frequently drop below what they paid for them. Now, this is not the fault of white people, because there's only black people living there. It's the behavioral differences, the high crime and all this sort of stuff. And this is something so black people would buy a house for $10,000, for example. Maybe it was with the GI Bill, but then they would have a situation where years later the house was only worth $7,000 because the neighborhood was in such a state. And there are other things too. The black person that would buy the house would say be doing the best out of their entire wider family. And because they're so tribal and still tribal as they were in Africa, all the relatives think they have the right to move in. So two people buy the house, a couple ostensibly buys the house, but then uncles, aunts, cousins, and fuck knows how many relatives all move in. So you think it's going to be two people, and suddenly there's 20 people and their kids. And they're creating mayhem. They're running around all the time. They've got no regard for other people's property, so they're jumping over the fence to play football or something. They're doing all sorts of things like that white people would disapprove of, and it's a rather unruly behaviour. So this is why, again, it's a behavioural difference. It's not racism, and it really irritates me that racism is racism, where it's not. It's a behavioural difference. People don't want 25 folks living next door running riot at all hours. Nobody wants that. Black people don't want it. And that's why the black areas degenerated so quickly. And there was, again, no one's bothering to mow their lawn or do anything like that. Now, I should add something else that was that just on 9% of the population in 1950, 9% of the US population was black. And this is a time when it was 151 million population with 9% African American. Now, today with 340 million people, I think it is now in the United States, and yet the black population is supposed to be 13%. Now that shows that in spite of the US population more than doubling, the black population has more than doubled again. So gone from what would it be? Say 13 million in 1950 to 44 million today. I'm just doing quick arithmetic in my head there. That just goes to show you that that it's like a threefold, in net terms, more than a threefold increase, and this is in spite of the fact that millions upon millions of abortions of black fetuses have taken place over that same time. So it goes to illustrate whether or not to be abortions, then the black population in the United States would probably be closer to 60, 65 million. But I just wanted to talk about this, so that this idea of a white flight. So white people are accused of being racist if they leave the area. They're accused of racism if they want to stay with other white people, and they're accused of racism if they won't move into a black area to raise the standard or something. So no matter which way you cut it, the interpretation keeps jumping and somersaulting to make sure that only whites are evil and racist and so on. When I don't accept that. I think behavioural differences were what caused. Now, again, you fought shoulder to shoulder with the black guy in the war, but still you don't want to live next to him, and he doesn't want to live next to you. So, I mean, that I think in itself says something. Also, this idea of the standard of the neighbourhood turning into a ghetto when black people are in the majority, and again, this idea of when a black couple buys a house in a mostly or all white neighbourhood, that they immediately bring in all their relatives, and the house turns into a centre of mayhem and drama, constant drama and screaming and shrieking and shouting and carrying on. So nobody wants to live next door to that. So again, that's not racist. It's just behavioural differences and standards of behaviour. No white family would allow their third cousins to move in and then inconvenience the neighbours or make noises at all hours and that sort of. You wouldn't allow it. You'd say, well, hey, do you mind considering the neighbours here? Is that okay? But I'll mention something else, a couple of other things. When in dealing with sort of black people in Africa, they've got a different sort of concept that if you go quietly and sort of not so much whisper, but talk softly and go quietly, that means that you're plotting and scheming against your neighbour in the tribe or some other tribal people. It means you're up to no good. What are you doing whispering in corners there? So that's immediately suspicious or viewed as a suspicious behaviour by the others. So what people do is they talk very loudly because that becomes in itself evidence that they're not plotting. So when the people in the house are, the black people in the house, they're shouting at each other and making all these noises, and and again the mayhem aspect. That's because that's their behavioural standard. That's how you show that you're not plotting against somebody. The idea of keeping quiet and not bothering others, or not polluting the neighbourhood with all sorts of noise and so on. No, they see it quite the opposite way around. So this is something again to consider. Now, having looked at the whole thing, these allegations of systemic racism, no, I just don't see it. I can see white people not wanting to live next to a likely or very likely or on balance of probability, the likelihood of a mayhem situation there. And that I fully understand. I wouldn't want, regardless of whether the person is African American or not. I wouldn't want that, and I don't know anyone who would. The blacks tolerated amongst each other, and again, driving down a street this was a fairly hot sort of summer's day in Pennsylvania, in this all black township. There seemed to be large families, and they're all on their front porches, and they're all sort of watching the street go, the world go by on their front porches, and it was kind of weird. I mean, what are they looking at? But again, it's part of that diaspora thing of, if you're inside, you're plotting, whereas if you're out on the porch, everything's openly declared, which is something white people, wouldn't think of. Privacy and not bothering others, and being polite and manners is something that's considered highly. But again, that's cited as evil, wicked, fascist, Nazi, white racism, and so on. So I couldn't see that the racist roads and the racist suburbs and the racist policies. I could see behavioural differences. I could see universities saying, well, look, 90% of the black people attend university don't make it past the first sort of couple of months. So, we really need to be convinced that you're going to make a go of this, and if you really have to convince us that this is worthwhile. If not, we'd rather not. We'd rather give the position to someone who we think will make use of it, and that person's going to be more likely to be white. Similarly, with white people not wanting to move into black areas, if you go into a drive down the street, well, the real estate's cheap and the place looks like an absolute shitscape. Of course, you don't want to buy there. That's not racism. That's somebody who wants to put money into an area that invest in a property, that is, put money into an area where it is clean and tidy, and where it's safe to bring up your children, and where your family members can walk around at night without worrying if they're going to get mugged or someone. Whereas, the black area has is a high crime area. That's not white racism. Whites didn't cause that high crime. Now, the another argument that I've seen is, well, that's created poverty in the black neighbourhoods. Therefore, they have to resort to crime to overcome the poverty. I don't accept that for a moment. I understand the poverty, people who are poor and hungry who are going to steal a loaf of bread, but that's not what's going on here. So again, I reject that. So the whole argument, the CRT related argument of the white flight and this sort of thing, I reject the whole thing. I see the point they're attempting to make, but they're not making a convincing argument. Far from it. They're just saying, hey, the outcomes were different. It's all because of racism, and I think we should all work to reject that out of hand. So that's my take on the post-World War II white flight type arguments. It was related to circumstances, situations, which, by the way, occurred in places like Australia or Britain, where there was no black people, or the black population was less than 1%. So it's clearly nothing to do with racism. That happened all across the Western world, again in Sydney, Australia, and Melbourne, Australia, as much as it did in places around the United States. I'd also add this as a thing: the northeast of the United States, Massachusetts, New York, and New Jersey, and all these places that were never slave states or were slave states quite briefly. So a very, very long tradition of non-slavery. And so the blacks who live there have been, certainly since for 300 plus years, have been free citizens, and in these areas where there are masses of Jewish activists talking about human rights and civil rights and equality and all this. I notice in those areas where all of those Jewish activists chose to live in all white areas. All of those activists, I looked at every one I could find. They all wanted to live in all white area. The screaming white lesbians that are raving about wicked, evil racism and Nazis, that they still live in all white areas. Why weren't they living in all black areas? Why is that? Well, it's because it's dirty and tidy, high crime, drugs. You won't be able to walk around at night without getting the shit kicked out of you. These are the reasons why. That's all of these northeast activists, social justice activists back in the day, and there were plenty of them there. The people who were writing songs about it, Malvina Reynolds and so on, who was Jewish, by the way. All these Jewish activists all wanted to live in all white areas. So I mean, the sheer hypocrisy of that. So again, it wasn't a uniquely American thing. It happened all over the Western world, again, where there were little or no black people. And so the idea that it was uniquely American or racist against African Americans can be just simply rejected out of hand. You've been a Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.